Grizzly has the most to prove going into the 2024-2025 season? I'll discuss that. Other former Grizzlies that should have podcasts that you listen to after Locked On Grizzlies, of course, and whether Memphis needs to add some more veterans after the Morris twins get picked up over the weekend. It's a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for being with me on this Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. It is the return of the 5-day work week here at Locked On Grizzlies. We can once again say each and every day this week, an episode will drop of Locked On Grizzlies, and hopefully you join myself and or DeMichael Cole each and every time an episode comes out. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts. As proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe wherever you get podcasts, whether it's Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube, literally anywhere you can get a podcast. Make sure you're subscribing in multiple places. Take us with you on the go. Whether it's the audio version of the show, YouTube continues to be a strong point for us, and we appreciate all of you checking us out on YouTube, of course, but subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, on Amazon, anywhere you get an audio podcast, as well as the video version of the show. I am your host, Joe Mullinax. Yes, that is host, no DeMichael Cole this time around. Life happens sometimes, and DeMichael will be with us numerous times this week. The beat writer for the Memphis Grizzlies for the commercial appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, is my co-host more often than not. But today it is I, Joe Mullinax, flying solo with you, and I appreciate you, dear listener, dear viewer, for joining me. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay, I think that it's important to point out that there is going to be a lot of preseason previewing kinds of things coming out, not just from us here at Locked On Grizzlies, but from across all the Grizzlies and blogosphere and all the different places that produce content, not just about the Memphis Grizzlies, but about the NBA at large, right? 'Tis the season as training camps get underway here in the next few weeks. I do think that it's important to point out one name in particular who has a lot to prove relative to what he may expect to get in a contract renegotiation with the Memphis Grizzlies. And it may not be the big man that you think I'm referencing. For me, Jiren Jackson Jr. has proven all he needs to prove. That guy should get extended by the Memphis Grizzlies as soon as both sides come to terms. But the player that has the most to prove for me going into this season, the one who may not be here long-term, is one Santi Aldama. And Santi Aldama is an interesting name for me going into this campaign, even more so now than he was a week ago because of the G.G. Jackson injury. Because as if you are an everydayer of Locked On Grizzlies, as you know, DeMichael and I have talked a lot about how G.G. Jackson figures to be a long-term four, at least in our eyes, an offensive stretch combo forward. Santi Aldama obviously filling that void right now for Memphis. A bigger body at about 6'11", but G.G. has a wider scope of offensive talents and skills, a little bit more versatile on both sides of the floor, and G.G. projects, at least to me, I don't want to speak too much for DeMichael, he certainly projects to me as a long-term answer at the four, whether it's a reserve or whether it's as a starter. Obviously, G.G. can still play the three, and he'll certainly continue to do that, but we're talking long-term here. Santi Aldama doesn't have much more long-term to discuss. Santi is going to be up for a contract extension here soon. Money is getting tight. We've talked about that numerous times, and we assume that Jiren Jackson Jr. is indeed going to get a pretty fat contract extension of the max variety, potentially. That money will continue to get thinner and thinner around the salary cap into the luxury tax. And we've talked a lot about the various aprons. We don't need to do that on this show this time. But understand that those aprons are very clearly impacting how NBA teams are establishing themselves, both in terms of short-term contention as well as long-term franchise building. So if you have your three dudes in Jiren, Ja, and Dez, and those are the guys that you're planning on building around, which by all means, I think there's a lot of logic to that, of course. Former Grizzlies account, Steven Adams stats. I say former because now, of course, with Steven Adams being on the Rockets, he's focusing there. Since the year 2021-2022, or the season of 2021 and 2022, at Funaki Stats, by the way, the Grizzlies have a record of 60-32 when Ja, Jiren, and Dez all play. That is a 65% win percentage. That makes them a 50-plus win team in the Western Conference. Usually that means you're a top 4 seed. They're 21-9 when the big three all played, but Steven Adams didn't. And this is coming from Funaki Stats, Mr. Steven Adams guy himself. So he's pointing out that record is even better without Steven Adams. Desmond Bane, Jiren Jackson Jr., and Ja Morant are the straws that stir the drink for this team. If those guys are on the court, they're going to be a good basketball team. Those are the priorities almost certainly, and they've already locked up Ja and Dez long-term. Jiren is the last one. What will Santi Aldama command? It's a fascinating question. The idea of Santi Aldama is probably a player that makes $12 to $15 million a year. 6'11", stretch big that can put the basketball down on the floor and get to the rim at times, but can also space the floor and hit some threes. We've seen that guy a lot more internationally, though, than we've seen him at the NBA level. And that is what he has to prove. Can he deal with the athleticism, the physicality of the NBA? Can he put himself in better positions to be a worthwhile defender? Not just at the rim, but in terms of defensive rotations and switches. That's one of the reasons that I like G.G. Jackson at the 4. Can he defend threes? Yeah. Is G.G. Jackson currently a 3? I think so. If you're able to make him a combo forward that can switch things and do a little bit more getting to the basket as a de facto big, there's a lot more versatility to his game than there is in Santi Aldama. And money, again, is going to get tight. Does it make sense if you're going to give Jiren a well-deserved raise to invest that much more money in a reserve big when you already have Brandon Clark under contract? Brandon Clark is making roughly $12 million a year. Zach Edey being on a rookie deal in the next few seasons helps. But how much are you willing to invest and spend in Santi Aldama, given that he hasn't been able to translate what he does in FIBA and Olympic basketball to the NBA so far? He has to show the ability to shoot the ball at a consistent rate. It can't be hit or miss. It can't be one night he looks the part. And Michael and I are on here on Locked On Grizzlies after a game saying, that's the Santi Aldama we need. And then for 2 games after that, he shoots 3 for 12 from beyond the arc, and Memphis loses those games because they don't have enough in the tank with the reserves. The injury to G.G. Jackson is a big opportunity for Santi. There is no competition there. He's going to be a major piece of the Grizzlies' rotation. Kennard, Luke Kennard, Vince Williams Jr., Brandon Clark, Santi Aldama. Those 4 are locks now, next to the likely starters of Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, Jiren Jackson Jr., and Zach Edey. Maybe Memphis slides a 10th guy in there somewhere, but those 9 are pretty solid to start with if you're building a playoff rotation for Memphis. And then Gigi, of course, will eventually be back around Christmas time, as we discussed last week. When Gigi returns, though, what do we make of Santi Aldama? Those early games are so important for him. Is he a trade chip? Is he a guy that alongside another bigger deal contract-wise and a first-round pick, you try to upgrade in the front court? Is that a guy that you make the determination you do want to invest in him? And maybe you trade a Brandon Clark or you trade somebody that has one of those bigger numbers that's on a deal beyond this year for an expiring contract. And you try to put yourself in a better position to be able to retain Santi Aldama's services. The idea of Santi as a floor spacer next to Jiren Jackson Jr., next to Zach Edey especially, next to Brandon Clark as well, that makes a ton of sense, but it's all theoretical, at least in terms of NBA consistent contribution, consistent production. Can Santi Aldama rise to the challenge? Can he get past screens on the perimeter? Can he go beyond when he has other physical players that are around his size or bigger, making his life miserable, trying to be a rebounder, trying to be a switch defender or a rim protector? That's what I'm looking for from Santi Aldama this season. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Hit me up on X at Joe Mullinax. How are you feeling about Santi Aldama going into the season? He's my guy with the most to prove. If he wants to be in the NBA long-term, if he wants to maximize his value with Memphis in particular, but in general, he needs to make his international flavor a little bit more NBA specific this coming season. Let me know if you agree with Santi being the player that has the most to prove. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by FanDuel. I'm a big fan of FanDuel. I know you are as well. And you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. Football has gotten underway, and America's #1 sportsbook has got you covered now and always, but especially now. We have something a little different for you with FanDuel here at Locked On Grizzlies. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5, you heard me right, $5, and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. What an amazing opportunity. With a YouTube TV base plan, you will be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game. That is a tremendous deal. All you'll need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. It is football time in America. The NFL is king when it comes to sports. The NBA is trying to catch up, but the NFL remains the champ, and FanDuel is a wonderful way to follow the league, both in terms of using their great app for overs and unders and all sorts of other action, but in terms of this YouTube TV NFL Sunday Ticket deal. Just visit FanDuel.com, download America's #1 sportsbook with FanDuel. So over the weekend, another bit of news broke, and it was fun news. Multiple bits of news broke, even though it is, of course, football season. There's still trickling of NBA information. And something that I found really interesting in this continued movement of podcasts, right? Lots of different players, lots of different NBA personalities have a podcast. And I realize this is kind of the pot calling the kettle black, since it's our podcast, myself and DeMichael, but we too have a podcast. I do wonder when the podcast bubble is going to burst, hopefully not on Locked On Grizzlies and the Locked On Podcast Network, of course, but I do feel like there's a lot of podcasts out there. Thank you, dear listener, dear viewer, for making us your first listen or your first watch each and every day. Locked On NBA should definitely be your second listen and watch, right? They do a great job covering everything around the league and all that goes about, not just with the Memphis Grizzlies, but all the NBA teams. Another one you're probably going to have to check out is Out the Mud. Now, if you're a Grizzlies fan, somebody that's been around a long time like me, and you hear Out the Mud, there's probably two names that come to mind when it comes to the Memphis Grizzlies and anything involving mud. And it's Zach Randolph and it's Tony Allen. You'd be onto something. These two guys have the Out the Mud podcast coming soon via the Title League. Shout out to TA and Zebo for hopping in on the content creation wave. I'm going to be checking out that show. I know you will be as well. But it got me thinking, dear listener, dear viewer, as someone who has consumed a lot of Memphis Grizzlies basketball over the last, 13 years, what other Grizzlies players from the past would I love to see have a podcast? And even current players too, right? Like Joe Morant would obviously be fascinating in a podcast. My first picks would be, unsurprisingly, for those of you that are familiar with my Grizzlies journey, Marcus Hall and Mike Conley, the other two members of the core four. And I don't want them to be part of Out the Mud because I think TA and Zach are going to have their own vibe and their own flavor to that show that's going to be a lot of fun. Mark and Mike would have a different angle to that era. A lot of good stories, just like Zach and TA will have. But I do think that between Conley being drafted to the team, right, everybody else was traded for in the core four. Mike Conley was a drafted player by the Memphis Grizzlies. Between that, between the realities of Mark being part of that big trade with Powell, coming to the city, being as familiar with Memphis as he was, obviously growing up here, going to Lausanne High School, I would want to see that dynamic. We know they're really good friends. Just a different way of approaching the same era of basketball, right? And again, TA and Zach are going to be amazing. I'd love to hear what Mark and Mike have to say from their angle, from their perspective, their own relationship within the organization, and obviously how that has stayed strong throughout the years. So Marcus All, Mike Conley, that's a bit of a cop-out. But the other half of the core four, I think that'd be a pretty interesting watch, a pretty interesting listen, podcast-wise. I would really be interested in a Mike Miller podcast. He obviously is in representation now. He makes the rounds as an agent doing podcast appearances. He's one of the guys a few weeks ago who talked about how soon they forget with Ja Morant. Mike Miller is the representation for Ja Morant. I think that Mike Miller having a podcast and maybe using it as an opportunity to shill for his various folks that are represented by him would be interesting. But I'd also anybody that's willing to talk about those early year Grizzlies, because I consider myself a Grizztorian, right? I wasn't a fan of the Memphis Grizzlies when Mike Miller first arrived back in the mid-2000s. I would love to learn more from those guys in particular about how the league was then, because I was in high school. I watched the NBA, but I wasn't as in tune as I am now. What it was like to play in the pyramid, those years of toiling and having to fight under Hubie Brown and getting to a place where you could be a playoff team, not having a playoff win, but still making an opportunity for themselves to get into the postseason. I would really be interested in learning more about that era of the Grizzlies. So Mike Miller would probably be a really good guy to have on the show for that, or have a show with for that purpose. And my last one will maybe surprise you a little bit. My last one might be intriguing for you. And it's a partnership between Steven Adams and John Conchar. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're rolling your eyes about. I can feel the eyes going into the back of some of your heads. If you hate John Conchar so much, Joe, why do you keep talking about him? He's a very interesting person, right? Over the weekend, it was announced that he signed a multi-year Nike shoe basketball deal. Doesn't mean he's going to get an Air Conchar or an Air Jitty. I don't think that's coming anytime soon. But this is a guy who is finding a niche in the NBA, and he's sticking in it. He's finding a way to make himself an NBA rotation player, even if it's the end of the rotation, right? So Conchar's sticking around, and his personality is unique. He's a very different dude in terms of how he says things are neat and like dunk shots. And he just seems like he has a straight line, or not straight line, a type of humor that is fun to interact with in a podcast. And obviously Steven Adams, anybody that has heard Steven Adams, watched Steven Adams, paid attention to any interview he's done, he's one of the funniest dudes in the NBA. And he's also one of the most straightforward, and he understands basketball a lot. He gives you a lot of insight into how he uses his body, the way that he creates opportunities off of passes, off of direct handoffs and different types of screens. He will go into the weeds, so to speak, and give you some detail while saying a one-liner that makes you laugh at the end. He has that ability to balance. So I would really like a Steven Adams and John Conchar, because I think they would balance each other nicely. There'd be a good mix of humor, and they obviously have some experience with this modern group of Grizzlies. So in the same way that I'd want to hear the Core 4 podcasts, whether it's TA and Zach, which is actually happening, or my Mark and Mike one that, isn't, whether it's the Mike Miller concept, the same idea of being a Gristorian, right? I love hearing about how things were, what the team looked like, what they could do, even in the short term of the last 5 years, right? Because that's roughly how long Conchar has been around. Obviously, Adams was here for a couple of seasons. Anything that you could gather in terms of what it's like to be a part of this group in this way, the drama of John Morant when all that stuff was going on, the issues with injuries. I'm assuming that they're able to talk about these things, which obviously with the Grizzlies organization is a pretty major assumption, right? Mike Conley is still an active NBA player, so he's probably not doing a podcast with Grizzlies ties or tendencies anytime soon. We'll probably have to wait a few years for Mike to retire for that. But I do think that there's a lot of possibility in former players, not just in Memphis, but across the way. If that podcast bubble pops, it's probably not going to be on them, because they have so many stories and they have so much perspective. I mean, the J.J. Redick, LeBron James one, which is over now, I'm sure, now that J.J. Redick is the head coach of the Lakers, which is still funny and weird to say out loud. Shout out to content creators getting chances to head coach in the NBA. I do wonder if you were able to take that model and apply it to the Grizzlies, who you would want to see. I covered a lot of ground there. Mark and Mike, a Mike Miller podcast, John Conchar, who, again, another current NBA player. Same thing with Steven Adams. So some of those wouldn't be possible right now, but who would you want to hear on a show? Who would you want to see talking on a show? I'm curious. Again, at Joe Mullinax, hit me up in the comments as well. Podcast ideas for former Grizzlies players. Maybe you pair them with a Grizzlies media personality. Maybe you want to see me on a podcast every once in a while with someone else. I will not leave DeMichael Cole. I will stress that. Me and DeMichael, he might leave me, but I will not leave him. Anything that you'd like to see in terms of the current state of affairs with the Grizzlies and other media types, Grind City Media does a great job with a lot of those types of podcasts. I'm curious, what would you like to see from former players or maybe just the media situation in general there in Memphis with podcasts? I'm curious, very curious indeed. Let's finish up this episode talking about veteran players. Another piece that came out over the weekend, a couple of pieces of news. Interesting to me, the return to NBA basketball of Marcus and Markieff Morris, right? Marcus Morris signs a contract, a 1-year deal with the New York Knicks. He's going to have a chance to play his 14th NBA season with the Eastern Conference contender. That is from Shams Charania of The Athletic. And then you have beyond that Morris brother, you have another Morris brother making a signing, and that would be Markieff, right? Markieff Morris. Markieff comes in a few days ago, and he is now a member of, give me 1 second, having some technical difficulty here. Markieff Morris is in the mix to be with the Dallas Mavericks, right? And that's a re-signing. Markieff was with the Mavs last year. So 2 teams that see themselves as contenders, Dallas and New York, adding 2 twins, right? Markieff in Dallas and Marcus in New York. These are 2 guys that have played a heck of a lot of basketball, right? 14th season in the NBA. That veteran presence is valuable. And again, looking at it through the lens of what the Memphis Grizzlies could do with that 15th roster spot that is available. The Morris twins are probably not the way to do it. I want to stress that. No judgment here that the Grizzlies didn't make that determination. I don't think Marcus or Markieff really moved the needle. They probably have other plans, whether it's converting Scottie Pippen Jr., whether it's leaving it open and just kind of seeing who gets waived as time goes on. There's lots of different ways they can approach that particular contract and that particular roster spot. Exhibit 9 deal. We saw that with the Knicks and Marcus Morris, basically saying that they have the ability to retain him, but it's flexibility, right? It makes him a little more flexible financially. Memphis needing veterans. I've struggled with the fact that a couple of years ago, Zach Kleiman talked about, do we really need to triple down on youth? Do they really need to do that? And then in their own unique way, they've kind of quadrupled down on it after he said that. Now they have older, more experienced people that they've drafted, right? Cam Spencer, 2-way deal, one of the older players in the college basketball this past season. Zach Edey, a ton of experience playing in college the last 2 years. He was the most dominant college basketball player in the entire country. They have a type in terms of the type of player they want mentally. And I do think that they are bringing in guys that are ready to help contribute more so than a project rookie, right? Like Brandon Clark was that guy back when he was drafted in the Ja Morant draft. Brandon Clark is someone that the numbers loved, except for the fact he was a 6'8" center who didn't have the best wingspan, 6'8". People viewed him as undersized. But he's such an athletic jumper. And again, it was the year of Zion Williamson and the dominance that Zion had at Duke. The number 2 most efficient player in the country was Brandon Clark. So I loved Clark in that draft. And I think that the Grizzlies really displayed the type they have, not just in that selection, but over the next several years in a Desmond Bane, in a Santi Aldama, who we talked about earlier in the show. Guys that kind of fly under the radar, that are self-made. At the point that you bring in a veteran, it's rare for you to find that kind of guy. Now, there's exceptions, right? They trade for Marcus Smart. They see him as a guy that can play multiple positions, unlike Tyus Jones. He actually figures to be a 2 guard more than he figures to be a point guard. Can play some point, but that's not the best position for him primarily. We saw that in the first 25 games with the John Morant suspension last season. Marcus Smart is not a true point guard. I do think that when you look at Smart in that perimeter player role that isn't the point, he helps a lot more. And again, obviously, he's played a lot of playoff basketball. He's played in the depths of the playoffs, postseason runs. That will pay dividends, assuming Memphis gets to the playoffs. You also have Derrick Rose on the team. And as we talked about here on Locked On Grizzlies before, I know DeMichael has said it and I have as well. When you listen to these players talk about veteran presence, Marcus Smart's name is usually not the first one that comes out of their mouths. It's Derrick Rose. Whether it's Joe Morant or Desmond Bane or any of these guys, they'll give Smart his flowers when, asked directly or maybe in passing, but they go out of their way at times to bring up what Derrick Rose brings to the table. So I may think he's washed. I may think he's not particularly good at NBA basketball anymore and they should invest in Scottie Pippen Jr., but that veteran presence matters. And as I thought more about it over the weekend, I realized that they have those guys. And you could argue that they have those guys in other players like Jiren Jackson Jr., who was selected in the 2018 NBA draft. He's preparing to sign his third NBA contract. Like, Jiren might be 25 years old, but he is a veteran in the NBA at this stage. He's the vice president, I believe, of the Players Association, for goodness sakes. Ja Morant entering his sixth NBA season, I believe. Desmond Bane entering his fifth. It's amazing to look at these guys and see them as still young because especially in the case of Ja and Jiren, being 25, that's still relatively young. You're not quite in your prime just yet. But the fact remains that they are becoming veterans themselves. And you want them to carry that load of leadership. You want them to be the ones out in front that these players like a Jalen Wells, a Zach Edey, a Cam Spencer, guys like Vince Williams Jr., Gigi Jackson. Your three best players should be your leaders. And you want supplementary guys behind that. Again, I don't think Marcus and Markieff Morris move that needle in that particular way for Memphis. I wonder what they're going to do with that 14th roster spot, but I'm totally okay with them not adding an end-of-bench veteran for the sake of adding a vet. Because as they approach this season as a contender, as they should approach it, their three best players are veterans at this stage. They're on their second contracts. They've played a lot of NBA basketball. They've been in this Grizzly system for 5 or so years. They have to be the ones that carry that weight, that be the front runners, that allow for these younger players to look up to them for all the right reasons. That is when your organization succeeds at the highest level, is when your best players are also your best leaders. They have a guy like Marcus Smart who can show the way, can model that behavior. To a lesser extent, I think Derrick Rose can as well. But again, the players probably disagree with my assessment. They think Derrick Rose most certainly can be that guy, regardless of how much he plays, regardless of how washed I may think he is. The players clearly see the value in D Rose. So Memphis still has that open roster spot. I'm not going to sit here and long for Markieff or Marcus Morris or any other veteran for that matter. I think that the core of their team is established, and they believe in the standard that they've established and built because they are, for the most part, their best players all were drafted by the Memphis Grizzlies. Jiren Jackson Jr., Memphis Grizzlies draft pick. Ja Morant, Memphis Grizzlies draft pick. Desmond Bane, Memphis Grizzlies draft pick. They have direct hands in deciding what it means to be a member of this organization, and they hopefully will lead the way moving forward, not some vet that comes off the street in September. Thank you all so much for being with me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It is much appreciated. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we will be back tomorrow. This will be our first week of full week shows. Since August, we took a bit of a breather there in August, half of September as well. But we're back in the saddle again every day this week. Our goal is to have a show for you. We'll start previewing around the NBA, teams we're nervous about out west, teams that shouldn't be on the Grizzlies' radar, how Memphis can utilize different rotation pairings and partnerships. Lots of different angles we plan on taking this week and beyond here on Locked On Grizzlies. Make sure you're hanging out with us. Make sure you're checking out Locked On NBA as this episode ends. Go check them out. Again, wonderful analysis of the league from West Coast to East Coast and everywhere in between. News, all sorts of different breakdowns. Check out Locked On NBA as we finish up here. Make sure you're liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing. Wherever you get your podcasts, we're proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. We're on Apple. We're on Spotify. We're on Amazon. Subscribe to the audio version of the show, please, please, please. And also check us out on YouTube as well as we build our following, continue to build our following there. DeMichael Cole should be back tomorrow. I look forward to being with him, and I look forward to being with you once again, dear listener, dear viewer, here on Locked On Grizzlies. Make sure you are liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing. Make sure you're taking care of yourself on this Monday. And until next time, I'm Joe Mullinax. We'll catch you next time.